This episode is brought to you by ARX. You want to be a successful strength training studio owner. The problem is you aren't able to deliver the safest, most efficient and effective workouts, making it harder for you to attract and retain clients, which makes you feel frustrated. I understand that it can be difficult to differentiate your business without the right tools. ARX's breakthrough adaptive resistance technology uses patented motorized resistance and computer software to give you and your clients the perfect workout every single time. BioFit founder John Zarbok says that ARX is clearly the superior tool to deliver the exercise stimulus. My clients are seeing insane improvements in weeks, not months. I could not fathom running my business without ARX. So here's how you get started. Number one, go to arxfit.com/HIB to get $500 off your ARX machines. Number two, book a call with the ARX sales team. And number three, learn how ARX can help you grow your strength training business. Go to arxfit.com/HIB so you can stop struggling to attract and retain clients and start to grow your strength training business with confidence. Lawrence Still here, and welcome back to highintensitybusiness.com, the podcast where we discuss high-intensity strength training and provide you with the tools, the tactics, and strategies to help you grow your strength training business. This is episode 345, and the topic of today's episode is all about decision-making. This is part 8 of an 8-part series on decision-making, which has been fantastic. And this is likely to be the finale, although I think I've said that before, so we'll see if that actually happens. And that's only because my guest and I can talk about one bullet for like 2 hours at times. And the benefits of this episode really are to help you make better decisions in your life and business, to increase the probability of the outcomes you want, and obviously ultimately reduce your stress as well. Today's guest is Dave Smith, PhD. Dave Smith is a senior lecturer in sport and exercise psychology at Manchester Metropolitan University and associate editor of the Sport Psychologist, one of the most prominent peer-reviewed sports psychology journals. His research interests include psychological issues in strength training, psychological skills training, make sure he's in the right words here, and decision-making processes in sports and other areas. Dave, welcome back to the podcast.
Great to be here, Lawrence. Thank you very much.
Great to have you, and thank you for making the time as always, and excited to get into some more decision-making and cognitive bias stuff. So we're starting with performing pre-mortem. So take it away.
Okay. So far on the last couple of podcasts, we've talked about various tools to improve your decision-making. And pre-mortems are another one that I think are really worth your listeners thinking about incorporating into their own business decisions with their gyms, etc. Basically, it's a technique developed by a psychologist called Gary Klein, and it's based on the idea of prospective hindsight, where individuals imagine that a future event has already occurred. So it's kind of the opposite of the post-mortem, which obviously everybody's familiar with. You know, something goes wrong and in your business, and afterwards you all sit around and you agonize about it and try to figure out why. But unlike that, we do a pre-mortem at the outset before a decision has been made. So before we've decided what we're going to do, we sit down and we basically imagine that we've made the decision. We might, war game it in several different scenarios. We might make decision A, decision B, and we imagine we've made these decisions and that they've resulted in bad outcomes. And we try to figure out why that's happened effectively. So this is a really effective way at identifying potential problems and solutions to them before you actually start, before you decide what you're going to do. So for example, there's quite a bit of evidence now in the academic literature about its effectiveness. So one study found it was superior to brainstorming techniques, which themselves are useful. But pre-mortems were better at identifying risks and possible solutions to various scenarios, like, for example, a computer upgrade scenario that a company had to make. And The researchers think it's probably because it promotes a more open, critical discussion of alternatives than you would get after the fact, or when people have already decided what they think they should do. Because once we've made decisions, we become very wedded to them and we defend them. We get really defensive with, no, this was a good decision for X, Y, Z reasons, rather than being open to the idea that, hey, maybe actually this wasn't such a great idea. So, for example, your clients might consider using them when they're deciding what to do when working with a tricky client, for instance, or when deciding whether to open a new gym, hire a new trainer. I know we were just talking about that in your own business, Lawrence. Buy some new equipment, maybe make an investment. So again, pre-mortems are really helpful in investment scenarios as well. So, they can be really useful for these kind of purposes. And I found them really useful when making big decisions. For example, if I'm thinking about doing an intervention with a client in sports psychology practice, okay, first of all, I start thinking about things that are within my control. And then I think about things that are outside my control that might happen if I do this particular intervention. And I found it so helpful. I know people laugh when I tell them this, but I take it to real extremes, such as, for example, I'll imagine I've worked with a client and it's been a total disaster what I've done, an absolute, disaster. The client sues me, complains to my regulatory body, and I get struck off. And I've got to think back and think, how did that happen? And I work backwards, thinking, how could I get to that point from where I am now? What things could go wrong? So I found it wonderfully effective in identifying problems and potential solutions in advance. And, there's a lot of research now that in a lot of business settings, people find this technique really helpful.
Wow. So I'm just thinking a good example in a strength training business would perhaps be making a hiring decision, as you noted, and it could be you. So in practical terms, you'd sort of sit down and you'd map out. Okay, so the bad outcome could be that this person's a really bad fit and ends up causing us a lot of pain for all parties involved, and maybe we lose clients and that kind of thing. And then you work backwards. So you start backward engineering how that outcome could happen. What are the things that we fail to do, or the mistakes we can make leading up to that for that outcome? So, for instance, it could be that you have a really poor hiring process. So you're not rigorous enough in qualifying them in, or challenging them and seeing if they're actually a good fit for your organization before you appoint them, for example. Am I mapping out a good example here?
It is a very good one. Okay. And the great thing about the use of pre-mortems is that they link in so nicely with a lot of the other techniques that you can use to sharpen your business practices. So you mentioned about hiring processes. Absolutely. What you might find when you work back is that your hiring process is too subjective, for example, and that you're very prone to being charmed by somebody who's talks really well in an interview, and in which case you maybe need a more algorithmic approach, like we talked about on a previous podcast, to your hiring. Or it might be the other way around. It might be you hire somebody who's really good, but you can't keep them. They leave really quickly, and that causes problems. So maybe then what you need to do is look back and say, all right, okay, the hiring process seemed to work, but why can't we keep really good staff? Are there things we need to be doing to keep our staff happy, for instance? And so we need to think about that. So absolutely right. You have to start from the point of view of, the thing has happened and it's not been ideal, and then think, well, how could that happen? And how could I head that off at the pass by doing something different in the here and now?
Yeah. So you've almost got like multiple, I don't know if a decision tree is the right model, but you've got like multiple outcomes that you've got to think could happen, right? Like you say, great person leaves, wrong hire. I don't know. There's probably more. And then you can backward engineer each one to see how you could best prevent that. I think that's genius. I mean, it totally makes sense.
Thank you. Yes, I think it works. It works really well with so many things that gym owners and personal training business owners have to think about. I mean, think about, the possibilities of buying new equipment, which is, almost endless what you could have in your gym. But clearly you need to think carefully about whether buying certain pieces of kit is, even though there might be nice toys that you would like, whether that would be an effective business decision. So again, you can use this to think about how that might impact your business, maybe opening new facilities, maybe moving your facilities. All of these are big decisions that you've really got to try as far as possible to get right. So I think pre-mortems are useful for any of those.
Let me ask you just a bit more about this, and I might be overthinking this and making this too complicated and making it less useful. But can you also combine the idea of evaluating how easy it is to reverse a decision or undo a decision? So you could do exactly that hard thinking we just talked about, that planning, and then you could also say, okay, well, we've got outcome A, B, and C. Let's look at how easy each one. If despite our best efforts in trying to prevent that from happening, let's say it still happens. Like how can we reverse or undo those decisions, and how easy? Like how do they compare? Right? Which ones are like that would be very expensive to reverse, or this one would be easier, or would that be taking this too far and maybe not making it as useful? I'm not sure if that would be that valuable in that context.
No, I think that is potentially quite an important thing that you could make part of the pre-mortem. Funnily enough, it is something I'm gonna mention later. This idea of avoiding painting yourself into a corner is actually quite important, and it's something that I was going to bring up later on, because I think that's really important. I think I've mentioned before in one of the podcasts this idea of the two-way door process that Richard Branson apparently always does. Always have an exit, always have a way out, don't overcommit, is pretty important. So maybe that should be part of your pre-mortem process. If things go wrong, is this going to be a mortal wound to my business, or is there a way I can back out? So with hiring staff, then clearly what you're going to have to look at is contract terms and how easy and legally how easy it might be to get rid of somebody who's not working out or causing problems, or how hard it might be to tweak things to keep somebody if they might want to leave. So absolutely.
Awesome. Love it. What's next?
Well, I think what's next really is, for me, a couple more things I haven't mentioned yet, a couple of tips that I've had from Annie Duke that are mentioned in her new book, How to Decide. And I've been working with these quite a bit and found very, very simple pieces of advice, but like a lot of simple ideas, very, very effective. So the first one is the power of negative thinking. And the point here is that in our culture, the idea of quitters never win and winners never quit, it's absolutely ingrained. But actually, it's really wrong, because in fact, quitters can often win and winners do often quit, because knowing when to quit is really, really important. Now, you wouldn't think that from listening to motivational speakers on YouTube and whatever, the kind of people who always tell you about that person who was rejected by everybody, who was told they wouldn't amount to anything, that their product was rubbish or whatever it is, and they keep plugging away, and years later it breaks through and they make millions. But the problem with that is it's prone to survivorship bias, because what they don't tell you about is all the people who kept flogging a dead horse and failed and never got anywhere. So it's really important here to understand the idea of opportunity cost. That's absolutely crucial. So basically, when we devote resources to one thing, that means we can't devote them to something else. Time is finite. We've only got so much of it, and we've only got so much energy. So therefore, it's really important to focus that effectively. And sometimes the wise thing to do is to quit when something isn't working and devote those resources to that something else. So, for example, when your business what isn't generating sufficient profit, but you keep plugging away, that's very common because of the sunk cost fallacy coming into play. When we've devoted so many resources into something that we feel that we've got to keep going, even if the costs clearly outweigh the benefits. People find it very, very hard to take that step to say, no, enough's enough. This isn't working. I'm gonna move on. It's a classic finding in the psychology research where they'll give people a scenario. For example, imagine you bought a concert ticket, and on the day of the concert, you're not feeling very well. It's pouring with rain outside, and you're probably going to get soaked going there. And what the research shows is that most people, even though in that situation the costs of going clearly outweigh the benefits, most people will still persist in going, because if they don't, they'll feel they've wasted that money. But of course, this is actually irrational because the money's already been spent. You can't recover it. And the sensible thing to do in that scenario would be to say, no, I'm not going to go. But people do this all the time. It's why people stay in unhappy relationships. It's why they stay in jobs that they're not enjoying. It's why they keep plugging away at things that just don't seem to be bearing any fruit. And funnily enough, it's sometimes called the Concord Fallacy, because when they were designing, the British and French governments were designing Concorde, which of course is an incredible piece of engineering, but it became clear long before it was finished that the costs were way too high and there was no way that they were ever going to recover those costs. But they still went ahead because they'd spent so much money already, they didn't feel they could stop. They would have got so much criticism and they would feel themselves that this was a massive waste of resources. So they couldn't stop and they went ahead and did it anyway. And of course, it ended up being, although it's an extraordinary piece of engineering, it was a massive loss maker. So the key thing here is try not to do this with your business. Sometimes you need to know when to quit. And you can use some of the tools we've explored already to help you in this, like the bias awareness raising and the pre-mortems we've just talked about. Think about, do you get to a point where the costs are too high? And okay, you've spent resources on it, you've spent time on it, you might have spent money on it, but if it's not working and there's no reasonable prospect of it working in the future, sometimes you've just got to say, no, I've got to go. I mean, look at Keysler Training. They tried to expand in the UK. They tried really hard. It didn't work. Unfortunately, wasn't really working. Rather than keep at it, at some point, they pulled the plug. I think quite sensibly. Unfortunately, these are hard decisions. They're really hard for any business. But the other thing to think about here as well, as we mentioned before about the two-way door idea, it's really important not to paint yourself into a corner. Always have an out. So don't put so many resources into something that you absolutely you just can't turn around anymore. You can't back out because you've got no alternative, because you've put all your eggs into that metaphorical basket. So, you need to be careful. So another.
Can I just give one example, which you might find quite funny, Dave, for opportunity cost, not so much sunk cost fallacy, although maybe a little bit. I have two cars, but one of the cars is a terrible little Opel Corsa, tiny little crappy car. And we had to buy a bigger car before our growing family. So I still have this little car in the driveway. And my father came over to visit, having not seen him in a couple of years because of all the restrictions, a couple of months ago. And we were talking about the car, and my dad's like, just we have very different. We think about this very differently. He was like, oh, you could get, search far and wide and get a really good deal on the car. I paid like under €3,000 for the car, to call that like $3,500 or something. And it's got a problem with the head gasket and a problem with the timing belt, which are huge, very costly problems that probably cost, with labor about $1,000 to fix. So it's not worth much at all. And it's almost to the point where I would pay someone to get it off my driveway, right? And it's just interesting how my dad looked at it. He wouldn't. I'd already spent some time trying to find the logbook, trying to sell it to a local mechanic, and the opportunity cost of that was really actually getting quite high because my time is better spent working on my businesses, right? And I was trying to explain it to my dad that I'd rather just get rid of it and almost pay 50 quid or 100 quid to get rid of it, then spend any more time on it to get a little bit back. It's just not worth it, right? When you look at opportunity cost, because what I could be doing with that time. And his girlfriend understood that, and she's nodding along, and he's just looking at me like, I don't get it. And I've asked. It's funny because where I've arrived to now is I was like, oh, I just need to get rid of this car. Because I don't know anything about cars, but one thing I do know is if you don't drive them or do anything with them for a while, then they might not start one day. And so I found this company that will take the car and give me like a really low fee, like €100, which is probably going to net me nothing in terms of the time, but also I have to insure the car for a day to drive it to the place where they take the car and all this crap. And I'm like, this is so ridiculous. And so I think that's probably an example that a lot of people don't relate to, because a lot of people own cars and upgrade cars and have to get rid of cars. So there you go. That's one, right? A lot of people spend so much time trying to save pennies, and they just completely devalue their own time and what they could be doing. And I just want to also say and clarify, I understand that, if you're financially really tight or in a challenging position, then obviously you have to perhaps be a little bit more sensitive to things like this. But I don't know, for myself, I have a mindset where I'm like, I can create income with my time, and it's like I want to give myself that resource to be able to do that, and I value that, but that's just because I run my own business and I don't have a job, so maybe that's partly why I think like that. Anyway, I'm digressing, but that's just an example I thought people might be able to relate to as well.
Yeah, it's a really good one, and I agree with you, Lawrence. I think understanding the value of time is so important, as we were talking about before the podcast. Time is our most precious resource, and of course it's far from infinite. We've only got so much of it, so it makes sense to spend it in the best way. And sometimes you can end up messing about with stuff that can consume large amounts of time for no benefit or not enough benefit. It's like, for example, let's say you've got a load of stuff you want to get rid of and you're going to chuck it in the bin, and somebody says, hey, don't throw that away, somebody will want that, why don't you put it on eBay? And well, the question there is it worth the money, the little bit you'll get for it, to waste all that time photographing it, cataloguing it, putting it up for sale, posting it out to someone?
I've made those mistakes so many times.
Yeah, exactly. So you have to question, and I'm not saying the answer is no, it's not worth it. It may be worth it for some people in some situations, but you should ask yourself the question always: is it really, worth doing that? So I think the other thing to bear in mind here is, that this idea of thinking positive being bad advice. I think better advice is think positive, but always plan for the negative. Think about what can go wrong, as we've talked about with pre-mortems. And the other key thing here is not confusing the destination with the route. It's really important to understand how you might fail along the way, and that failing isn't a bad thing, because that's how you're going to learn. But so if you learn from the little failures, you can build to a big success later on. And I think that's really, really important as well. So learning from failure, Although the problem with that is sometimes, people are terrible because they often take the wrong lesson from success, but sometimes they can take the wrong lesson from failure as well. So we need to be very careful that when things have gone wrong, or we're doing our pre-mortem to figure out how things might go wrong, we really do alight on the correct reason why it might go wrong, because it's very, very easy to take the wrong lessons from events that happen. So for example, there are classic ones in the world of investing where, for instance, if you go back to the kind of dot-com boom and bust, people are piling money into these very dodgy stocks for the most part, and they all crashed and people lost all their money. And when the dust settled, a lot of people took the wrong lesson from that, because what they did was they thought, I'm not going to buy any tech stocks again. They're a terrible investment. Okay. And then what happens is they get all excited about all these companies selling complex financial instruments like derivatives, packaging mortgages up, and all this kind of selling them on as bonds and all this. And then they start putting a lot of money into finance stocks. Then they crashed in the financial crisis, and people look at it and they say, oh no, I'm not going to make that mistake again. I'm not going to buy finance stocks. The problem here is they've taken the wrong lesson instead of the correct lesson, which was simply don't buy overvalued stocks. Yeah, it's not about telling you that any specific kind of company is a bad investment. It's all about the price that you pay. So the problem here is sometimes we can take the wrong lesson from failure. So we need to be very careful, and we need to think carefully about what we can do to improve our decision making in the future.
Love it.
So there's one other thing. A lot of people say, when I'm doing seminars about decision making or working with clients, and I'm saying you can use this tool and that tool, and they say, hang on a minute, it's all very well having a systematic, disciplined approach to decision making, but it's impossible to apply all this deliberation to everything, because then you can't do anything. Every decision's going to take you so long to do, you're going to end up having a paralysis by analysis kind of situation. So I think it's really important that we consider when we need to go slow in decision making and use these tools, and when we can perhaps go fast. But really, there's some really important statistics in Annie Duke's latest book, for example, where she says surveys have shown the average American spends 150 minutes a week deciding what to eat, 50 minutes deciding what to watch on TV, and 90 to 115 minutes deciding what to wear. So this all accounts for 250 to 275 hours a year. Yeah. So the point again is important to re-emphasize. Time is a crucial and limited resource, so it's important that we don't waste it on trivial decisions. So this is the key. Don't waste your time on things that don't matter. Instead, what you could do is be like Barack Obama, the previous president of the US. When he was president, he only wore 2 types of suit. Okay? Very simply. Why? Because it saved him loads of time deciding what to wear. He only had to wear one suit or another suit, and that saved him time for more important stuff like leading the USA. It's
and willpower, right, as well, a separate resource. Decision fatigue, as you're touching on too, right?
Oh, very much so, very much so. If you waste, you're going to have decision fatigue if you spend ages worrying about those small things and you don't have the energy and the focus to focus on the big things. So
basically, eat the same thing every meal every day, wear the same thing every day, and just let your wife pick the TV show.
Yeah, and that makes life a lot easier, a lot quicker. I don't know if you're familiar with a book called The Paradox of Choice.
I am, yes.
Yes, Barry Schwartz's book. And he makes the point in there, that we waste huge amounts of time on trivial decisions where there are many, many choices, but ultimately the outcome probably doesn't really matter, but we spend ages deciding which brand of this to buy and which, like you say, which TV show to watch. So that can really slow down decision making. But actually, using a good decision making framework can actually speed up your decisions. And the key here is knowing when we can go fast for low impact decisions and when we need to go slow for high impact decisions. So for high impact decisions, it's really important to slow down when we're tempted to use system one and go with our gut. We need to give more careful consideration to the issue, rather than going with our gut and saying that's what I want. So, for example, we were speaking a while ago to a fund manager who tells me he makes all his important investment decisions on a Saturday. Doesn't make any in the week. The reason for that is that if he does it in the week, he can, telephone through and buy or sell millions of shares right away. But he's not necessarily given himself enough time to determine whether that's a good decision. Whereas if he does it on a Saturday, the markets are closed till the Monday, and that gives him a couple of days to mull it over, to use system two in order to make a good decision. So he's using that kind of little behavioral blocker that means that he has to give himself the chance to think before finally pushing the button and making that big decision. But equally, it's also really important to know when we can speed up to free time for the more important stuff. And that's where Barry Schwartz, if you've read the book, you'll be familiar with this, developed his only option test. So the idea here is you imagine you're going out for a meal, and we've all done it. You can't decide what to eat. There's several things on the menu you really like. What one do I choose? So his advice is to ask yourself when looking at each item, if this was the only thing I could order off the menu, would I be happy with it? And then what you do is you decide amongst the options that pass that test by flipping a coin. Because it's not going to matter if you like them. It's not really going to matter which one that you choose, And that will speed up your decision-making no end, because you can apply that to anything in decision-making. Sort the world into things you like, things you don't like, and you can just go fast with your decision when the outcome, it doesn't matter, when it's not important. So you might say, well, but how do you know? How do you decide whether it's important? So here what you do is you ask yourself if the outcome of your decision would have a significant impact on your happiness in a year's time. And if the answer's no, you can probably speed up. And you can then repeat that for, like, say, a month or even a week. Let's face it, if you end up making the wrong decision in a restaurant, you have something you don't like, you might go home and moan about it and say it spoiled your evening. You're not going to be worrying about it in a couple of days' time. So it's not important. So you can go fast on decisions like that. But, with things that are really important because they're going to have a longer term impact on your happiness, you probably want to go slow. But when they're not important, you can trade off accuracy to save time with trivial decisions.
Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, and so that way, by using these simple rules, you can actually speed up your decision making, and when you'd really need to use all the tools that we've talked about, and when really you don't. You don't need to sit there in a restaurant with a checklist and do the pre-mortem on your dinner, do you?
Yeah.
But you might want to do it when your business is at stake.
Let's go.
This episode is brought to you by ARX. These are the most intense exercise machines I've ever used. I remember how fast the pull-down exercise took me to muscular failure and beyond. On the final negative or eccentric excursion, my tank was practically empty, but the adaptive resistance enabled me to continue to perform work until the predetermined end of the set. This experience was very profound and made me realize how effective ARX is in helping clients reach a high level of intensity in their workouts and ultimately produce the best results. I also love how ARX measures and tracks range of motion, rep cadence, total output and time, and more with real-time audio and visual feedback. These features are powerful sales and retention tools to help you convert and keep more clients. As a listener of the High Intensity Business podcast, ARX is offering you $500 off your machines. Just go to arxfit.com/HIB to book a call with the ARX sales team to learn how ARX can revolutionize and grow your fitness business. Again, go to arxfit.com/HIB. And now back to the episode.
Let's go.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing I think was inspired by Paradoxical Choice. I heard through, I think it was Tim Ferriss podcast. He talked about always picking a maximum of 3 things. So, for example, when we were choosing, and in fact, I talked about this on a recent podcast that will come out before this one, in terms of evaluating scheduling software for our personal training business. So there's so many tools out there, right? There's like probably hundreds of different tools. And I deliberately selected only 3 because I didn't want the paradox of choice, right? I didn't want there to be too many options and it take too much time and become quite stressful trying to compare lots of options. And also there's more buyer's remorse is one of the points of the book, right? Is the more things you consider, the more buyer's remorse you'll have once you actually commit to something. And so I deliberately made it free and I selected those 3. And then it was like, that was my filter. And then all I did is I created a matrix and compared the features between the 3 that were most important to us, which resulted in us choosing MindBody, which is the software we use and software that is probably the leader in our space and probably the most popular option. But there were other good options out there, and I didn't just want to go with the herd. I wanted to make sure it was the right fit. I'm not sure if it is actually the right fit, but it's not bad. And but it's also important to say, this is again going back to reversible decisions. It's pretty easy for us to unplug and move to another platform in the future if we decided to, although it does meet our needs for now. And I just wondered also if you had, I know this is something you might have touched on in our previous podcast, Dave, so I apologize and forgive me if I've just forgotten, but do you have any good decision-making frameworks for the big decisions? So, there's like, I don't know if you're familiar with like the A3 problem-solving template. It's like one that's quite popular for solving problems in businesses. Maybe that's slightly different. And I just wondered if you had any sort of frameworks that you follow for making decisions, big important decisions that will have, consequences.
Well, what I tend to do is I tend to just go through the techniques that I know that work in order. So a lot of the things we've talked about on the podcast. So I always start off by considering my biases, and I try wherever possible to use somebody else as well for them to consider how my biases might be influencing these decisions. And I've got other certain biases that I know to watch out for because I know I'm prone to them, but it's good to have a third party there to give me advice. Then I'll go on to making sure that I take the outside view. So using some of the tools, again, we've talked about to make sure I consider that from other people's experiences. I look at what's happened to other people who've maybe made that decision and how it's turned out. Then I'll go on to things like the checklists, the algorithmic approach, which I think is really important. I'll use pre-mortems. I'll do all of those things. So it's not really I couldn't call it a framework. What I would say is it's an evidence-based approach that combines several tools that I found really helpful. So I just go through those when I'm making decisions with clients, or if I'm making big decisions for myself. But here's the other interesting thing. There are some big decisions where you can actually go fast and you probably don't need necessarily a framework, even though they are important. And these are the kind of decisions that Annie Duke talks about as a sheep in wolf's clothing. And what these are high stakes, close call decisions, which you can do fast, where even though they're really important, the downside of your different options might be slim to none. So as Annie says, when a decision is hard, that means it's easy. And what she means by that is that if there's so little to choose between the options, you can often choose either of them or any of them if you know that they'll likely result in a positive outcome anyway. So you don't need to agonize between different choices. So an example might be if you're trying to figure out what exercise program to give a client, or let's say in your gym, you're trying to figure out a consistent approach that you want your trainers to take, for instance. So you might be thinking, right, okay, do we want to focus on whole body workouts or split routines? Do we want to focus on super slow or a slightly, a faster cadence, for example? Well, actually, with those kind of decisions, do you know what? It's probably not that important, because all of these methods have positive benefits and little downside. So I had a chat with James Fisher about this a while ago, and we were saying this, that really in the long term, if people train reasonably sensibly, as long as they don't train in a way that's going to hurt themselves, that pretty much you're going to get in the long term the same benefits from almost any reasonably sensible program. It's very, if you compare, for example, the difference, I know James Steele is doing some really interesting statistical modeling on this at the moment. For example, comparing people, if you look at the literature and compare people who don't do resistance training with people who do and compare the strength, quite clearly the difference between those two is going to be far greater than the differences in strength from doing different programs. So I think we can overemphasize the importance of that kind of minutiae. Do you know what? And I'm probably offending some of your listeners saying this, but I don't think it's that important. And all these arguments you see in like the high intensity community about, different cadence and whatever, to me, it's a bit of a nonsense. It doesn't, in the long run, if you look over a lifetime of several decades at least of resistance training, which is what we want people to be doing, right, as a lifelong endeavor, is it really going to make any difference if they do, if they do more negative only, or they do super slow or a 5-5 cadence? It probably isn't. And the most important thing is they keep doing it.
Yeah.
And don't do it in a way that will hurt themselves.
I love this. I think it's so true what you're saying. It's so useful. I think it's interesting though, because it's sort of nuanced, because, for example, let's say you're creating a system in your business where you're trying to figure out how do you design workouts, then from the perspective of it delivers the same outcome for the client, regardless of what it looks like. That's like very liberating, because it's like, okay, we don't have to absolutely nail this, every factor of it. But then if you look at it from a perspective of retention, like we got to make sure it's exciting, and safety, then obviously it does complicate things a little bit, and you do perhaps need to consider it a little bit more. But there are times where I'm sitting there and I'm trying to refine a system within our business, and I get a little bit fatigued and frustrated with trying to design like the perfect whatever workout design process or fill in the blank. And then I kind of take a moment and think, you know what, like I will probably get back to this and improve it. But knowing what you just said, and obviously I knew that ahead of you saying it, because I did a podcast with James Steele on that recently. And obviously I thought that's what you were referring to. But we actually covered that exact topic you just mentioned.
I've listened to a lot of the ones you've done with James, but I haven't. I think there was one that popped up I haven't listened to, so it's probably that one.
No, you have far better things to do with your time, Dave. So I respect that. but no, the point I'm trying to make is it is that I'm kind of in two minds about it as I talk about this, because I do think it is important to, some of the minutiae can be important in certain contexts, but at the same time, it's There are times where I probably obsess over some of those details too much, which don't make a difference. And yeah, when I just find myself getting frustrated, I might just hit pause, say I'm going to come back to that in a month, knowing that the outcomes are probably going to be similar, right? At least in terms of like adaptations clients going to get from training, if that makes sense. So like for the listeners who don't understand what I'm talking about, I'm just thinking of an example, like, like if we're obsessing over different grips on the chest press, or and when we use a certain grip and a certain cadence and a certain protocol, right? And obviously I think about these things in relation to like providing novelty, and but I don't really think about it in relation to providing a different kind of stimulus, because I don't think it matters, right? So stuff like that is what I'm referring to.
Absolutely. I think it's really, really important to realize. Otherwise you end up going down a rabbit hole of, again, you defend your own position. You have a position on this kind of exercise is optimal, or like you say, this, you have to use this leg spacing on the leg press, or this grip on a pull down.
It's
ultimately that's
so liberating.
Not that important,
because the lens that is more useful is safety, retention, novelty, keeping the client engaged, keeping them adherent, right? But not the stimulus. You say the stimulus is like the same, or the effects. The differences are so small, it's probably not that important, So I totally agree.
Exactly. But the retention thing's important, and not just from a business perspective, but from a public health perspective, because that is the key thing, that people keep doing it. Even if what they're doing isn't absolutely scientifically optimal, whatever on earth that would be. I mean, it doesn't matter. That it's better that they do it, that they keep doing stuff, than they don't do anything at all, if that's the alternative.
Yeah, I have to say as well, because I don't think I said this since that podcast with James, but that's probably the most complicated podcast I've ever done, at least for me. And I didn't get it. When he was going through the study and all the data he'd analyzed, I just didn't get it. And I kept getting him to try and describe it in different ways until I did. And only after the podcast, I was driving, and I'd published the podcast, and I was driving, listening back to it to understand it. And then I got it, right? And I understood it. And I parked the car and I texted him, all caps, I get it now. Because maybe it's just the same with our conversations, right, Dave? I mean, how many times there's been numerous times during this series where you've explained something and I'm like, yeah, no, I don't get it. And then I reflect on it, or I re-listen to it, and then I get it. And so if anyone's feeling a bit insecure out there listening to my podcast, being like, I don't understand it, you're not alone, right? It's stay with it and you will eventually.
Absolutely right. There's, everybody, if they're being honest, goes through that with so many things. And it's just so important to stick with it and have another look. And some of this stuff can be complicated, but that work that James is doing, it blew my mind when I first saw it. James Fisher shared some things with me on that front, because we're thinking of including it in our paper. And I'm like, very cool. Wow, this is massive. This is absolutely huge. It makes so much sense. And it's just a way of looking at and analyzing the data that I don't know why. It's crazy. It's like, I don't know why. Well, people have thought of it before, obviously in one or two contexts, but not many. And I just find it amazing, because you can apply it to so many things. So if your listeners haven't heard that podcast, check out. Please check it out.
It's episode 340. Dr. James Still, into individual variation and response to resistance training, the truth about effect sizes and other exercise science flaws. So we'll link it up in the show notes of this one, episode 345. But yeah, if people want to hop over and listen to that straight after this, then please do.
Fantastic. Well, right. So after eight episodes, I think we're pretty much there, Lawrence. I think that's kind of all I can offer on decision making. But I just really hope that your readers have listeners have found it helpful. Certainly these are techniques that are evidence-based and that I found very, very helpful in my own work in sports psychology, but also more generally in my life, making important decisions. And I found it's certainly strengthened my effectiveness as a practitioner no end. So I'm sure it can help people in their business if they can take at least some of these things on board. And it's not easy because some of them are counterintuitive and some of them do require a bit of really honest self-reflection as well, which, people can be reluctant to do. So, we've explored lots of biases and heuristics that can lead to suboptimal decision making. And, if people can open themselves up to the idea that actually understanding your vulnerabilities as a decision maker is actually a really important way of making you more effective, then that's great. We've hopefully come up with some decent practical applications of the knowledge to help people make better decisions.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think this has been an amazing series, and I think it's absolutely invaluable. And I know you've had really good feedback from your network, Dave, and from students and the like. And we've had really good feedback too. So I've had a number of strength training entrepreneurs who obviously make up a lot of my audience who really enjoy this series because these tools and these frameworks and mental models are invaluable, in helping us make better decisions in our business and life. And I just absolutely love this stuff. And I'm excited actually I'm going to go through the whole series myself, re-listen 1 through 8. And for those listening, I will link up all the other parts of the series in the show notes, episode 3, 4, 5. So there'll be 1 to 8 there, and you can actually go from the beginning. Because I think this could be a standalone podcast. There's some great ideas shared, but you talk about cognitive biases and this. You didn't go through each one because, frankly, we didn't want to. We wanted to spend time on other stuff on this one. So if people want to really understand what you mean by that and what those biases are, then I encourage you to start from the beginning, start with episode 1, and it's worth the investment because the ROI in your life and business and relationships and everything from consuming this and actually acting on it, and that's important too. Although just being aware of it is pretty valuable, is enormous. So yeah, but I don't know. I don't know this. Well, Dave, I mean, you haven't done many podcasts outside of this one, have you? So I don't know how many people are actually really talking about a lot of this stuff. Not to the depth you are, anyway.
Exactly, very, very few, I think. So I've really enjoyed the opportunity, and I'd certainly love to come back at some point and maybe talk about some other issues or related ones in a bit more detail. So I'd love to do that. But thank you for your kind words. I know we've had some really nice feedback, and people at the university and my other academic colleagues have certainly commented on these and enjoyed them. But it's great if your listeners can get some practical use out of them as well, as you say.
And the last point we had actually is just to reiterate any key books. So you talked about Annie Duke's book, How to Decide, which sounds really good, and I might end up reading that soon. But any other key books that you want to mention as well? And I might just look back at some of the other episodes to highlight some of the important ones. But any that come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, Annie's first book as well, Thinking in Bets, is definitely worth a look. That's the kind of funny one. I hope if she's listening, I hope she doesn't mind me saying this, but people raved about that book, and people whose opinion I really respect. And I thought, I've got to get this. When it came out, I got it. And the first few chapters, I was a little disappointed because I thought, well, this is just very basic undergrad psychology with a bit of bio and a little bit about a poker career. And I'm like, I'm not really getting what's so great about this. Then when she got into the application, I'm like, wow, now I get it. This is great. And, so that's really worth, and a few people, other people, like some of my students who've read it have said the same thing, that it takes a little bit of introductory material to really get going, but once it gets into the practical applications, it's brilliant. So I'd recommend that. Michael Mauboussin's books, of course, as you know, I'm a great fan of his work, so strongly recommend Think Twice. Also, The Success Equation, which looks at how to distinguish between skill and luck in business, investing, and in sports, is really worth reading. It's a fascinating read. And, if you think success in life, in business, or in anything else is very deterministic in terms of you take steps X, Y, and Z, and that produces success. When you read that book, it's a real rejoinder to that position. So that's really good. We've talked a lot about checklists. So there, I'd recommend Atul Gawande's book, The Checklist Manifesto, which is a real classic. And we mentioned Barry Schwartz's The Paradox of Choice, and another one. The importance of randomness and the impact of randomness on life. Leonard Mlodinov's book, The Drunkard's Walk, is great on that. And of course, the granddaddy of them all really is Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman's classic. A summary of decades of research on biases and heuristics, which is a great place to start. And I believe he's authored a new book recently, which I haven't read yet, so I can't comment on that one. The other ones that I'd recommend would be, I think, deserve an honourable mention anyway, would be Nassim Taleb's works, particularly Fooled by Randomness, The Black Swan, and Anti-Fragile, as they all have useful decision-making material. And I think in many ways, Nick Taleb's explorations of the narrative fallacy and survivorship bias, if I was to choose, one thing for people to take away from this podcast, it probably would be the importance of understanding the sort of 1-2 punch combination of those two things. They are massive, because if you understand the flaws in the ideas of narratives of success that we often see, the advice industry, the kind of 7 rules of successful people and all that kind of stuff, then I think that's really important. Understanding how the narrative fallacy combines with survivorship bias to perhaps produce often advice that isn't necessarily that useful for individuals on how to succeed in business and in life in general. I think really all we can do in life is actually try to make good decisions, use all the cognitive tools we have to make good decisions, and then we have to just let the chips fall where they will. What else is important in life? Annie Dukel argued there's only really 2 things. There's the decisions you make, and there's luck. Luck being the things you can't control. You can't control your genetics. You can't control the environment you're brought up in. You can't control many things that might happen to you, or to a very limited extent, like becoming ill and maybe being unable to fulfill your potential in your career. But what you can control is the decisions that you make. And even things like, working hard on something, that's a decision in itself that you've made, whether consciously or subconsciously, to devote effort to something. So really, decision making is just massive. It's making good decisions is really the key thing to do to try to produce good outcomes in your life. But also, I think it's really important to be at peace with the idea that ultimately those outcomes are not fully in your control. They never are. And people make this mistake of thinking, well, if I work so hard and I do X, Y, and Z, I'm bound to be successful. Well, that's not really the case. But what you can do is at least you can put the odds in your favor somewhat by making good decisions and doing the right things. And I think beyond that, then once you've done that, it's important just to be at peace with the randomness of the world and the randomness of life, and realize that even really good decisions can lead to bad outcomes, if you're unlucky. and just be at peace with that, I think is really important. Don't beat yourself up when things go wrong. If your process is right, you've made the right decision, then you've got to be comfortable with that. If you made the wrong decision, then learn from it, But don't think that that you can judge a decision by the outcome. You can't, because if you make a decision where there's a 99% probability of a good outcome and a 1% probability of a bad one, people don't understand this. A lot of people think that means you're guaranteed a good outcome. You're not. You might be unlucky and get the bad one. But on the other hand, you could make a bad decision and be fortunate and get a good outcome. And understanding, therefore, that is crucially important. So, in investment, investors often see this. I was listening to a fund manager the other day talking about exactly that and saying there was a decision he'd made to make an investment in a company. It didn't work out. But when he went back over his decision-making process, he said, you know what? I'd make that same decision again every time, every day. Because I'm not judging it by the outcome, because I know the likelihood of that bad outcome was tiny. And that takes a lot of courage to do that and not say, well, what an idiot, I've messed up there because you've had a bad outcome.
I try and think about this when I'm picking my fantasy football team this evening, Dave. Making sure that because I had a very bad week. This is such a bad example because people think Lawrence has far more important things to be making decisions about. But on a micro level, fantasy football is actually a really interesting sort of experiment or fantasy sports for sort of testing these different things. And for example, I had a really bad week this week, and so I went in to change my team, and it's really tempting to just like discard all my players, right? I obviously have the wrong team, but I actually probably made the right decisions. I just got unlucky one week, because overall I'm doing quite well. So I resisted the temptation to score some penalty points and only make a couple transfers. So that's not probably the most appropriate and beneficial thing I could add following your amazingly profound wrap up to this podcast, Dave. And you listed a whole load of books, which is great. And for those who want to go even further down the rabbit hole and read even more books about this stuff, there's loads of books and resources listed on all of the blog posts for each episode in the series. And you can go find the series over at highintensitybusiness.com. And obviously, if you go to episode 345, you can find the entire series there as well. Dave, any parting thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, not really. No, I think that was pretty much it. I think I'm happy. Well, talking of being at peace, I'm quite at peace that I've kind of shared kind of what I know and what can help people in this regard. But obviously, if people want more information, I'm more than happy to discuss any of these things with them. They can email me at the usual place, d.smith@mmu.ac.uk, or they can call me up and I'll happily discuss any of these issues with them. I just really hope people have enjoyed it and found one or two things that they've been able to take away and use.
I'm sure they have, Dave. And for everyone listening, to find the blog post for this episode, please go to highintensitybusiness.com, search episode 345. And until next time, thank you very much for listening.
Let's go.
This episode is brought to you by ARX. You want to be a successful strength training studio owner. The problem is you aren't able to deliver the safest, most efficient and effective workouts, making it harder for you to attract and retain clients, which makes you feel frustrated. I understand that it can be difficult to differentiate your business without the right tools. ARX's breakthrough adaptive resistance technology uses patented motorized resistance and computer software to give you and your clients the perfect workout every single time. BioFit founder John Zarbok says that ARX is clearly the superior tool to deliver the exercise stimulus. My clients are seeing insane improvements in weeks, not months. I could not fathom running my business without ARX. So here's how you get started. Number one, go to arxfit.com/HOB to get $500 off your ARX machines. Number two, book a call with the ARX sales team. And number three, learn how ARX can help you grow your strength training business. Go to arxfit.com/HOB so you can stop struggling to attract and retain clients and start to grow your strength training business with confidence.